So winners and losers. International trade, actually like any bit of economic activity, potentially creates winners and losers. As I hope I've explained, we increase the overall bundle of stuff that we can consume if we trade. So there's a sort of net gain there. The question is, in a sense, where does it land? Who gets it? Who gets the benefits from trade? And the best way I think of thinking about this is that international trade essentially changes prices. You can get higher prices for the things that you produce lots of because you're good at it by selling them abroad, and you can get lower prices on the stuff that you import than producing it inefficiently at home. And that's the channel through which we get winners and losers. It affects people as consumers. So I like to have low prices, but sometimes if my country is starting suddenly to export a lot of goods, the prices I face at home might actually go up. So there's a potential winners and losers issue there with consumers. But most of us consume a fairly similar bundle of goods and services. What really distinguishes us, one person from another, or one place from another, is the production side. I might work in an export industry, and when international trade goes up, I do very well. And so do the employers, everyone involved with that industry. If I'm in an import competing sector, we open up trade and suddenly from overseas, we get cheap supplies. The prices I'm facing go down, my firms suffer, and indeed ultimately might even go out of business. We hope that people can move easily from import competing sectors to export sectors. And they'll earn higher, they'll earn more, and that's absolutely fine. But sometimes that sort of movement is very different. And because the harms of trade, my firm going under, is very concentrated, it's very big, it's worth me lobbying the government to offset it. It's a quite different incentive system from me as a consumer, where international trade reduces the price of lots and lots of things by tiny amounts. And so what we typically find is the losers from trade are more vocal and more organized than the gainers.
There's no question at all that, trade has absolutely grown the global economy, made a huge contribution to lifting people out of poverty, which is really important. I mean, it's absolutely essential. Trade is an enabler to prosperity. The more we trade, the more prosperity gets shared. However, it's also very clear, especially in developed economies like the UK, there has been a huge disparity in the distribution of the benefits of trade. And that's, of course, the big friction point. And there's been a terrific backlash against trade as a result of that, not just in the UK, but in places like France and Germany and the US too. And we're seeing that translate through into our politics, of course, becoming much more nationalistic in focus, more populist in focus. And that's all having a terrific impact on our ability or inability to come to global agreements as politicians are busy trying to serve their domestic voting base. But ultimately, it's really important that trade contributes to tackling inequality, to making sure that everybody gets a part of the benefits, whether that's jobs or growth opportunities, investment in their local towns and cities and regions. Actually, a lot of that's got nothing to do with trade. It's much more about national economic policy, or the failure of it to distribute the benefits of trade coming into the economy overall. And the UK is particularly acutely feeling this, because we are quite possibly the most centralized of the G7 countries. Too much is run through London these days in the southeast, and that's come at a terrific cost to other regions, particularly in the north and Midlands and coastal areas. That should not be the case. That's not trade. That's, like I say, national economic policy, industrial strategy, sometimes people call it. But those two things are two sides of the same coin. We have to trade well, make sure trade is as easy as possible to make it as simple as possible for companies to thrive. That's what drives the public purse. That's what pays for our public services. Uh, but make sure that the benefits are distributed evenly and fairly across the country.
I'm Rosa Crawford, and I lead on international trade at the Trades Union Congress, or TUC, which is the UK's National Trade Union Centre, which brings together 48 affiliated member unions from across the economy and represents over 5 million workers. For the TUC, we believe trade is vital to jobs in the economy, but it must be on the right terms in order to promote good jobs, the highest standards of workers' rights, protections for public services, and workers' data in the UK and globally. We believe as unions that the government's approach towards trade post-Brexit has been fundamentally flawed, in that it has made it harder for us to trade with our closest and most integrated trading partner, the EU, on which around 4 million jobs in the UK depend. Jobs across the economy, but particularly in manufacturing, chemicals, and food, have been saddled with delays and additional costs which have put jobs and wages at risk. No trade deal the government has negotiated to date has come close to substituting the EU in terms of potential job gains. Furthermore, while our trade deal with the EU contains obligations that fundamental workers' rights will be respected, the government has ignored these commitments by passing laws such as the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act, which undermines the fundamental International Labour Organization Convention on the right to strike and freedom of association. Meanwhile, a third of UK trade deals are with countries where there is widespread abuse of labour and human rights, and they do not have effective mechanisms to enforce labour standards. These trade deals, therefore, make it easier for capital to go where it's easier to exploit workers, putting downward pressure on pay and conditions in the UK. We're also concerned that the government is currently negotiating new trade deals with more governments committing human rights abuses, including the Gulf states, India, Mexico, and Israel. So what are trade unions doing to campaign against these threats? Well, fundamentally important is that we're working with our sisters and brothers in unions in many of the countries the UK is negotiating or has negotiated trade deals with. It's crucial workers in all countries stand together to collectively demand protections for trade union rights and workers' rights in trade deals, and for trade policies that promote good jobs and reduce global inequalities, because it's crucial that pressure comes from all sides in negotiations. As the TUC, we've signed a number of joint statements with trade unions in countries such as Kenya, Japan, Colombia, Turkey, the US, and Australia. In the case of the UK potentially breaching its commitment to workers' rights in the EU-UK agreement with the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act, the TUC has jointly raised concerns with trade unions from across the EU, as well as with the EU-wide Trade Union Confederation, the European TUC, which we as TUC continue to be a member of. As a result of this joint lobbying, the EU Commission has raised an official complaint last October with the UK government about the Strikes Act, and this pressure has been really, really important in putting the government on the back foot. In the case of the UK-Israel trade talks, we've been working closely with civil society groups such as Amnesty and the Trade Justice Movement to call for these talks to halt. In March, the TUC wrote to the Trade Secretary calling for the UK-Israel trade talks to stop, stating the government should not be engaging in trade talks with Israel, as the International Court of Justice has found it plausible that its acts could amount to genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, we are hopeful that soon we will have a much more positive political environment in which to operate in. We anticipate there will be a change of government in the next 6 months, and while the TUC is politically independent, we share a history and values with the Labour Party, and so we are hoping we will be working with the Labour government after the election. The TUC is working and has worked closely with shadow trade ministers And we are very encouraged by Labour's National Policy Forum document, which states that the Labour government will put human rights and labour rights and decent jobs at the heart of its objectives in trade talks and will engage with trade unions in trade negotiations. Labour has said they'll prioritise negotiating a closer relationship with the EU, which ensures UK workers do not fall behind those in the EU in terms of protections for workers' rights. And Labour have said they'll work to reduce customs checks on goods between the UK and EU to lift costs on businesses that are putting jobs, wages, and conditions under pressure. Of course, we will continue to work as a union movement to keep Labour to these commitments, and working with civil society organisations like Trade Justice Movement on this will be crucial for keeping the pressure up. And we'll continue to work closely with our sister trade union centres in the other countries the UK government is engaging with in trade policy and trade negotiations to keep up the campaign for workers' rights to be respected in trade deals. We need to work globally as a union movement to counterpoint the power of global capital and multinational corporations, which has had such a negative impact on the global trade agenda. So I hope my intervention's been useful for your deliberations. Do check out the TUC website and at TUC Global on Twitter for more information about our lobbying on trade. And thanks very much for your attention today.